Today on the podcast, we have Steve Newman. Steve is a master at the 100-mile distance. He has gone from the back of the pack to the top 5% of the field over the last 10 years. And he's learned how to train his body, how to listen to it. If you're running a 100-mile race or want to, this is a great conversation with a lot of takeaways. All right, everybody. Joey Wilson from Tracer here, and it is my pleasure to introduce and interview my good friend and mentor, Steve Newman, today. So Steve is a really excellent example of somebody who has had some longevity in our crazy little sport of ultramarathons, particularly in the 100-mile group, in the 100-mile event. But I would say it's not just longevity that Steve is bringing to the table with his running. He's actually thriving. And as an engineer, I like to say that Steve's race times are inversely proportional to his age. So that's just a really geeky way of saying that every year that Steve gets older, he somehow drops like an hour to 2 hours off of the same 100-mile course. Particularly the races in Utah being either the Wasatch 100 or the Bear 100, both ultra marathons with significant amount of vertical, 20,000 plus. So I think there's something really to be learned from Steve, and I'm excited to have this conversation. So thanks so much for doing this, Steve.
Well, you're so kind, Joey. However, I think you were just politely telling everybody that I'm really old.
Hey, listen, regardless of the age, I mean, I want to point this out. Last year at the Bear 100, you came in the top 20, I believe 18th or 19th place overall,
yep.
Which, if I did my numbers correctly, and I'm sure I did, puts you in the top 5% of an elite field. I mean, it's not like the Bear 100 is some small race that nobody's ever heard of. There are major names going to the race. Jeff Browning was there. Luke Nelson was there. Paul Terranova was there. Carl Meltzer was there. And so what you've done is pretty significant. And I'm excited to just do a deep dive here and ask you a ton of questions and get your experience. So tell us this, like, let's get an idea of where Steve Newman comes from even from like a childhood aspect. I mean, tell us a little bit about, like, did you play sports growing up? What did it look like to be the 5 to 10-year-old and then 15-year-old Steve Newman?
A really nerdy guy, but I did love to do sports. I was born in Boise, grew up in North Ogden. I grew up playing baseball and soccer and football in junior high and high school. I'd say not the greatest athlete, especially in skill sports, but I mean, I worked hard. And as far as endurance sports, my brother was on he's about 6 years older than me, but he was on a swim team, and they would ride their bikes from North Ogden up to Lava Hot Springs. And that was kind of my first experience of someone doing something that seemed kind of long distance and more endurance, and that kind of captured.
For somebody who doesn't know where those two locations are, like, how long of a ride would that be?
I don't really know. I mean, in a car, I think it'd still take you 2.5 hours to get there to Lava Hot Springs from North Ogden, doing 70, 80 miles an hour. I don't know. But so I mean, it was in the next state, and but that captured my imagination, and I remember him telling me how he would draft off of like semis when you could on a bike, and how intense that felt. And then so I started cycling a little bit with my newspaper out money. I bought like an $800 Centurion Le Mans bike. It had BioPace. It had is it the Prestis, the narrower tire, I think, and no one in my neighborhood had seen that before. And I go on these long bike rides by myself. I in high school, I'd ride up from my house to Logan and back. I think it was like a 75-mile ride, and listen to Queen, like all 5 albums of Queen on the way up with my shirt off, and got severely sunburned. But did that 2 or 3 times. I also broke one of the valve stems and didn't have a patch kit, and my mommy had to come pick me up in Logan once. But anyway, that was kind of where I started doing more in my opinion, viewed to be more extreme kind of things
Yeah.
a little bit.
Most kid, and how old were you at the time? This was in your teens?
Yeah, like 15, 16,
Yeah.
16.
So look, most 15, 16-year-old kids don't have the patience or desire to go out and ride for 75 miles on their bike on a road, what was the motivation behind that? Why did you feel like that was something you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think really my brother inspired me, and it was just fun and exciting, and I had my Sony Walkman, aging me there, and just get on the road and just get into music and by myself and think and push myself, and it felt good. It just felt good. I guess that's the answer. It felt good, so I did it.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So you're riding your bike, 15, 16 years old. When did you decide to go for your first trail run? When did it go from biking to running? What did that
Yeah,
look like?
so a long time. Yeah, and I ran track a little in junior high and high school. I was a pretty slow 400-mile guy. I would run flat-footed and with my head tilted back, like I was Carl Lewis or something on some movie. I don't know, where they have poor form and their heads way back and dramatic. I don't know. But it wasn't until my buddy Ben in law school, uh, so that would be at age, I don't know, 29, 30, where I started running in Big Cottonwood Canyon, up the Desolation Trail in Big Cottonwood Canyon, and we wanted to exercise. I did start. I'd always been in decent shape, so I definitely first goal was to keep in shape a little bit during law school. Law school's stressful, and had a baby, and reasonably newly married, a couple years married by that time, and maybe, yeah, and also, so I wanted some stress management as well. So we started doing it there, and we do like a 40-minute run, and thought we were with some vert on a trail, and we thought we were like the coolest people around. There was only one shoe on the wall for trail running at REI at the time, so it was a little bit early in before the sport became as popular as it was today. But did that during law school, and then moved to Las Vegas after law school and practiced law there for a couple of years. That was hard to trail run there, mostly run around parks and some things. And then I moved back to Utah, practiced downtown Salt Lake at a firm based out of Philadelphia. And then my buddy Ben, he'd gone to Chicago, and he came back, and then we started trail running again. Definitely needed it to get in shape. It's working around the clock, and just wasn't completely happy with life because I felt like I wasn't taking care of myself like I know I needed to. And so we started running again. We started in the winter, almost just trudging in the snow, and things just bloomed from there, until I don't know, that was maybe 2006, 2007. I ran my first 100-miler in the Bear 100 in 2011, and then did 7 Wasatches almost in a row, I think, after that, and I've done 2 Bears since then as well. There's
So
COVID year I didn't run. Go ahead.
let's let's go into that first experience of running your first 100. Like, what kind of training did you take into that first attempt at 100 miles, and what was your experience like, just an abridged version of that?
Yeah, so I've been trail running, but not running a lot of miles. We'd already done Kings Peak once, I believe, and hiked the Grand Canyon a couple times, rim to rim, and then I may have even ran it once or twice, rim to rim. And so I was getting into more the you know 2.5 hour run on a Saturday was kind of a long run for me, maybe 3, and um, I decided to pace a guy named Philip. on the Wasatch 100 that year. I was actually just training to pace. I was nervous about pacing that I wouldn't be able to keep up with him. He'd
Yeah.
done a sub 24 the year before, and so I was actually just training for that, and then paced him, and that was pretty amazing experience. And the Bear 100 was coming up 2 weeks later, and Phil encouraged me to sign up for it. Back then, you still could, and so like I got into, I think Bear like 7 to 10 days before it was starting, and it was just I'd been running by heart rate, and he kind of gave me like a threshold just based on some stats I'd given him that I've been tracking, and not a lot of people have been doing that, but Phil had, and I'd been running on heart rate with a heart rate monitor before I even met Phil, and then he kind of just gave me a threshold, and I just stuck with it on Bear and just said, well, here we go. We're just going to see what I can do, and I don't necessarily. I
So
think I was
he
doing
told you don't. You were wearing a heart rate strap, and he said just don't go over this heart rate.
Yeah, it was 165 beats per minute. He just kind of pulled that out of some stats, and I was so scared of not finishing, and I'd only been training about 90 miles a month, which I wouldn't recommend anybody do it. But it was just like, if I don't finish, I'll be a little embarrassed. But let's see what I can do. Matter of fact, I've discouraged others from doing it, and I probably shouldn't, because it was actually a good experience for me. But I worry about people getting injured. But anyway, so I stuck with that 165 because I didn't know what else to do for a game plan. And there was one time where this older lady who tended to finish pretty close to last at Bear quite a few times. Tough lady, but there's a time where she was even ahead of me on the Bear. But slowly, because of the heart rate approach, people would burn themselves up on the uphill when I was hiking, and I'd tend to pass them on the downhill. And throughout the night, I just kept on getting a better advantage and passing quite a few more people. And I finished like 32 hours, something maybe. Maybe a little bit more, but I believe it was in the 32-hour range, and I was pretty stoked. It was like the most amazing experience in my life to think I could do that I did on low training, that I stuck to the plan, and then I was hooked ever since. So,
Yeah, yeah. That takes a lot of courage to just dive into something that, you'd seen some people, you'd been pacing, you'd kind of been getting into the sport. And I think for anybody, I mean, I ran my first 100 last year, and it took a huge amount of overcoming my feelings around the daunting task and the monster that is the 100-mile distance that is scary to even click sign up, right? Scary to even get in
for
the
sure.
race.
Yeah.
But and I'd like to talk to you more about that later. I've got some questions queued up around that. Okay, so you run your first 100, and nothing to scoff at, because any 100-mile finish is a huge accomplishment in my mind. Whether you come in later or sooner, it doesn't matter. Like the ability just to get one done is such a huge deal. But towards the back of the pack, or maybe not back of the pack, you're not chasing the cutoff at that time, but obviously not where I want to just point out, not where you are today, which I think is really fascinating, because it's not like you showed up and just ripped off a 24-hour, out of your genetics here. This is something that I think the real thing that I want to point out here is that you're getting better at the sport every year. You're doing something that we should uncover here that leads to a long-term progress. It's not a flash in the pan. It is a something that's accumulating over time. And I think a lot of my questions are geared around towards uncovering that, because I think it's a great model that a lot of people could learn from, not to have a short-term gain mentality, and to train and race in a way that's sustainable, if that's what you care about, that you can go from a 32-hour Bear to the top 5%, coming in at just over 23 hours, I believe was your time last year. And that's there's a lot of substance in that decade plus, in that 20 years of training, almost 20 years, 15 years.
Yeah.
Actually, 2011. So we're about 13 years out. So so let's go over a high. Let's take the things you've learned here, and let's go over a high level view of what you're doing now, not necessarily what you've done in the past, but what does a training cycle look like? It's the winter in Salt Lake City in Utah. There's snow on the ground. What are you doing over? Let's say it's the off season. What is in a high level view? What does the off season look like to Steve Newman? And then how does that progress towards race day, say in the fall, which is typically the races that you're doing?
So I used to exclusively just backcountry ski for 5 or 6 years in the winter, thinking that was doing my body a service by resting. But then I kind of learned that I wasn't easing back into mileage slowly enough, and I started getting as I got over like close to mid 40s. That's when I'd start getting overuse injuries, and it seemed to be because I loved backcountry skiing so much. I wouldn't start running till May.
And
Like
that likely puts you in a highly developed aerobic capacity, but it's like you're a race car with spare tires. Maybe your joints and ligaments just couldn't take the aerobic output that you could produce. And is that a good assumption? Is that accurate?
it's a fascinating feeling when your engine is totally souped up, like you can kill it and your legs can't keep up. Yeah, it's an interesting feeling, and you don't realize how dangerous that is until you start getting those injuries, and then you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I really gotta ease into my miles. So I
Yeah.
like to just I don't even do, maybe I could, but I don't even do like threshold runs or anything. I just stay in zone two, and for me, heart rate wise, I think that's probably, I don't know. This isn't completely scientific, but it's about 125 beats per minute to maybe 152, somewhere in there. And off season, winter, I'd like to stay in those lower numbers. There's just no need to push it. I really only train for one race. I like to do the Bear. I used to do the Wasatch, but Bear's been my thing lately. And that's forever away. It's in September, and I like to be slowly increase miles so that come May, maybe mid May, I can at least do 180 to 220 miles, somewhere in there, and then kind of build from there during the summer. So I view it as this crescendo. It's this slow takeoff in January, February, to all of a sudden, and usually I might be in the back of the pack with some of my, or at least, yeah, towards the back of the pack with some of my buddies, all winter long, and even up until all of a sudden something happens in June where bam, my efficient heart rate running in zone two just takes off, and it's noticeable usually where I'm starting to be closer to the front of the pack with a lower heart rate, and my body desires to go faster. And so hopefully by June, July, I'm pushing it more towards the higher end of the zone two. And because that's what I'm going to do race day, and particularly on my long races on a set, or long runs on a Saturday, I'd like to start out high in that zone two, almost borderline zone three. So about right now it'd be about 152. And pretty much consistently do that July and August, somewhere in there.
So let's go into that a little bit. What like what do you think is the most important part of getting to that? You mentioned kind of a turning point, an inflection point where you're holding back early in the season intentionally, is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
You're okay with your friends going ahead of you. You're intentionally keeping yourself down. You're not doing much, if any. Let's say intensity, right? There's no intensity there. You're not going beyond your aerobic threshold, let alone even getting close to your lactate threshold. So you're going easy, you're holding back, and then you said in June things start. You start to feel a turn. What do you think's happening in your own mind? Like, is it the is it that you're bringing your miles up slowly, and then once you hit a certain number of hours or miles or feet of vertical or whatever it is, where that gets accumulated, that suddenly your body just says, okay, because you mentioned there's kind of a feeling you start to get. What do you think's leading to that?
Well, first, I think the most important thing is to train your body to efficiently burn, and it does that if you just stay in zone two. Um, but really, yeah, it's increasing the miles. I think when you can get, you know, maybe 160 miles a month for 3 months straight, your heart rate will, and you stay in that zone two, your heart rate's going to start dropping, and you're going to crave
So
to go faster because your
40
effort.
miles a week. So
Yeah.
40 miles a week to get to that 160, you start to see gains there. What would you equate that in hours for you? Like for people who don't always run the same terrain that we do,
Yeah.
or whatever. Like what would you say is a number of hours that would be comparable to your 160 miles per month? How many
Yeah.
hours per week?
So I did 178 miles last month, and unnecessarily so, but like it's feeling healthy and it's fun. And my wife runs with me. We do run with our buddies. We're not doing super long runs on the Saturdays, but that's about a hour and 45-minute run, 4 days a week, and a 3 to 4 hour run on a Saturday would put you, pretty close to 50 miles a week doing that. So like eight miles 4 days a week, and then a 15 to 20 miler. And I don't know if you can do the math on that, Joey, but I think that puts you pretty close to that. Almost put you at 200 a month. But I like to,
Okay.
every 3 weeks, I'd like to rest and really cut. So 3 weeks on, and a local coach in Farmington, she gave me that advice, 3 days, 3 weeks on, and then the fourth, let your muscles rest. So I usually cut my mileage back to 30, 35 on that fourth week, 30 to 35 miles that fourth week.
Yeah. So in terms of hours, because people are going to be, that's the point, is to not maybe go for miles, because you go for miles and you're slower or faster, naturally, that will affect things quite a bit. Um, but let's go and say, you're saying when you start to get towards that 10 hours a week of aerobic training, low intensity, things start to really take hold. And then you also mentioned that, kind of ramping up for 3 weeks gradually and then backing off. And let's maybe use that as a segue into this next question. One thing that I've seen you do is, even when it's not planned, when you're not on your 3 weeks on and then 1 week down, I've seen you wisely back off when maybe something, when maybe you feel your training's not being absorbed by your body, where you feel a little extra loading, or maybe you're feeling an injury coming on and you want to just, squash it immediately. Tell us a little bit about your mentality around backing off, not as a plan, not as part of your plan, but more as something that you're doing on the fly.
Yeah, I think I always took great pride in, I think people tend to overtrain on ultras and not listen to their bodies. Um, and I used to take great pride in that. I felt like, I used to be able to consistently do like a 29, 28 on Wasatch with only doing like 150 miles a month, 3 or 4 months before the race. And, some people were doing 250 and still not finishing in that range. And so now, like last year, it was cool at 50. I had one of my best race ever on Bear, and um, the most I ever ran was 27 miles. That was my longest run, single run. It was 27 miles in about 6.5 hours, and it was in the Cottonwoods. And so, but you'll see some people doing crazy long back to backs, and I shouldn't say crazy. I mean, everyone has their own system, but I think that listening to our bodies and maybe not overdoing it, but still trying to get high quality results, will equate in longevity. And to me, that's what it's all about. I'm 51 and I want to be doing this when I'm 60, 65 if I can. It'll take some luck, once you get in the 60s probably, but it's all about longevity. So yeah, like I started spraining my ankle a little bit more, and I had one year where early spring I sprained it and it wouldn't get healthy, and I kept on rolling it. And so that was happening this spring a little bit. I sprained it twice, and so I backed off for a week or two and did some PT, ankle strengthening, and just to make sure everything was okay. And especially in the spring, bear's like 5 months away or whatever, and so why would I push it now? And just, I think the goal is to be able to get into June healthy, and for sure July, but I think it's usually we get injured when we're ramping up, and after we've ramped up, if we're healthy, and then that's when the fun really begins. The mountains have opened up and we can just kill it. But most of my injuries seem to come in that buildup towards the end of June, July, where you're really killing it. You really feel that crescendo where you're really starting to hit your stride.
I want to take a quick moment and tell you about a product that I think will help you nail your next marathon or ultra marathon. To do well in these events, you have to train correctly. You have to know how to build your endurance, how to build your strength, how to build your speed, your economy. And it's not always obvious how to do that. So what better way to train than to receive daily workout recommendations from people who are winning these races? These are the pros that have been there and done that and have dedicated their lives to understanding how to make the most of your training. That's what Tracer is. Tracer is a new system that brings adaptive, personalized workout recommendations to you through a mobile and web app on a daily basis for a fraction of the cost of traditional one-on-one coaching. So check that out. You can see more. You can learn more about how that works at tracerfitness.com. There's a free 14-day trial, so there's really no risk. You can go in there and play around with the system and decide if it's for you. I personally have used Tracer for preparing for a 50-miler last year, my first 100-miler this last fall, and recently a ski mountaineering race. And in all three of those events, I exceeded the goals that I had for myself and did extremely well. So check it out, tracerfitness.com. So to put this in perspective for people who aren't from Utah, who aren't training for necessarily the Bear 100, they don't know what the Cottonwoods are. What Steve is saying here is that maybe 2 or 3 months out from the race is where you really get serious about ramping up your mileage. And before that, when you're 5-6 months out, you're just trying to get into that transition. Like, you don't want to injure yourself or overdo it, overcook yourself 5 months out when really you should be peaking at the right time. And you're also pointing out that your goal is to go into those peak months healthy so that you can really drive it. And you found that you don't get injured in those big months of, say, 2-3 months out from a race if you've ramped into those critical, this is the age old thing of base building, right? Like, you've established some strength and some endurance there so that when the training really gets real, meaning your mileage is going up quite a bit, you are prepared, you're strong, your muscles are ready for even something like avoiding an ankle roll because you've developed your tendons over those early months. Which is, let's go into those 2 to 3 months out. When do you like to start to actually do more of a structured workout? How often would you say you do start to push it, if at all? And how often, and what do those workouts actually look like as you get into, say, critical race season training?
Yeah. So, I also like doing this because that's when, at least in Utah, the mountains open up and we get up at 10, up above 10,000 feet, or, run between 9 and 10,000. I mean, uh, that's the dream, is to get there and just kill it and just enjoy the
That's when the
mountains.
snow's gone, in other words.
Yeah, it's so fun, right? As opposed to, some people train for early hundreds in like March, and well, you're stuck training in the winter, and that's not near as fun to me as killing it in the cottonwoods or wherever later. But um, so I like, so if I just run Wasatch was always like it's the weekend after Labor Day, so it's usually the second weekend in September. Bears is usually the last weekend in September. So if I was trained for Wasatch, May 1 is my date where I want to have transition to be able to do, 150 to 200 miles. Bear being a little bit later, I don't mind waiting 2 or 3 weeks. And once, right about 3, 4 months before, I guess in the last couple of years, and especially last year, I was doing it more purposeful, but like once a week, do a threshold run, and that's um, essentially, my right now, my like for Wasatch, I won't allow my heart rate to exceed 152, which I think is about where my zone 2 ends. And so for a threshold run, I'll try and get it up to in the 170s if I can. And usually early in the season I can, but come like early September, it's hard to even get it up that high because I've been doing a threshold run every week, and my fitness is improving. And so I'll do that threshold run. I still sometimes like to play around in especially in May, move my heart rate, um, peg my heart rate at certain levels in zone 2. So, especially depending on how I feel, but sometimes do like a 135, sometimes do a 145. I only like to run 5 days a week. And so I like to rest the day before my long run. So I rest on Fridays. And then, but Saturday, long run, um, hopefully you're getting it by May. I'm getting into the 4 to 6 hour range, closer to 6, hopefully. And I like to push that long run on Saturdays up to the 152 mark, because that's what I'll do on Bear, and I'll train that way every Saturday. And but as far as really pushing it, it's only that threshold run where I'm going over 152, and that's and I'll do it sustained for about 45 minutes, and I think I can get it. I still will run for about an hour and a half that day, but significantly roll back my effort after that 45-minute sustained threshold run.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because I think that's a little different than the way most people think about it, in terms of maybe not most people, but certainly the way I think about doing a long run. Oftentimes we think long, slow distance, right? If we're going to go out for a 4 hour run, that would be maybe something that we would intentionally stay well below our aerobic threshold, and keep it really easy, because we're telling ourselves, I got to be out here for 5 hours, 4 hours. Whereas for you, you're kind of looking at that as like, okay, I'm going to actually go right up to my aerobic limit here while I go into my long run here. Which I think is maybe a good segue into your race strategy, because you mentioned just now that's how you like to start the Bear 100. That's how you like to start a 100-mile race. So just summarizing your training here, early in the season, you're staying very disciplined. You're keeping it easy. You're making sure your muscles aren't getting overly beat up. You're paying attention to any kind of oncoming strains or injuries. And then another beautiful thing I want to point out here is that you're designing things around your local environment. So you're designing things that you love to do. And I've heard Killian Jornet talk about this. Like, if you don't really love training, then you're in the wrong sport, right? Like, some people just want to race. They just want to check a box, but usually they're not as successful as somebody who actually enjoys the process. And what you just pointed out was you're kind of ramping up so that you can go train in you're saying the cottonwoods, and let's
Hmm.
replace the cottonwoods with the thing that's making you psyched, the place you want to go, the place you want to be. And you kind of intentionally wait for that snow to dry up so that you can go do these big routes up in the mountains of Utah where things are very beautiful. And that's where you really get psyched about what you're doing. And that plays right into, you've probably gravitated towards the Bear 100 and Wasatch 100 because that season plays out around Utah. And I think if somebody's listening to this and they're from another state or they're in another environment, they may need to think about how do you create a season that you're really excited about, right? Because that's probably what's going to give you the patience and the drive to go out and train for these long hours and to really accomplish what you want to accomplish. There's a lot of locality in your strategy here, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, well said, I think. Yeah.
So let's go into your race strategy. So you're saying, okay, I'm practicing this, like, I'm going to call it a fast start, because for most people running 100, myself included, I'm like scared I'm going to blow myself out in the first 20 miles. And I get the sense that it's a little different for you, that you really like to go up to that aerobic threshold, and of course not lactate threshold. That would be, who knows how that ends. But do you like tell us a little bit about your race strategy and how you would continue on that thought of doing your Saturday long runs at a higher clip than you're actually doing maybe your weekly runs?
Yeah, I'll say my race strategy really started with Philip being my mentor way back on the first Bear. And it was, you can go up to this heart rate, but don't pass it. And so my mentality was, well, I'm always going to go right up to where that threshold is, because I want to be able to go as fast as I can. And I learned after that first Bear that it was okay to do that. Like, I can survive the whole race and by starting out that way. And then, you get 400 or 500s under your belt, even though I only do one a year. And that just gives you a lot of confidence to know you'll be okay. And so, I mean, and I can't say that that's everyone else is going to have a similar experience. And I don't coach other people. I mentor if you want to come run with me, and love to do that. And I'd like to pontificate about ultramarathon running, but my experience is that I can do that. And so, so this year when I run the Bear, I will push it right up to 152 beats per minute. And if it starts exceeding that, I'll walk. I mean, you don't freak out if you go over a little bit here and there, but you really want to be disciplined and make sure that you keep it about 152. And you'll notice that if you're in good shape, that sometimes you're going to have to walk a little bit. You should notice on the downhills that your heart rate's dropping, and so it's almost like you're resting on the downhill a little bit. And then you'll notice about mile 35-ish that your heart rate will just start dropping. Like, if you're trying to keep it at 152, it'll be really hard to do then. And maybe you can't anymore. And all of a sudden, it's fascinating how your body recovers. But you could do, I don't know, 11-minute mile pace at mile 10 of the race, and your heart rate will want to skyrocket past 152. And you could do that same pace at mile 95, and your heart rate might not even go over 120. It's really fascinating how your body changes. So about mile 35 in, the heart rate isn't a good measure anymore for me. It's kept me not starting out too fast. It's also prevented a lot of lactic acid, so I shouldn't be suffering from a lot of lactic acid in my body later on in the race. And so then I switch over, and I started doing this in 2017, and that's really, I think, where my race has even started improving more. Was I'll switch over to, my first setting on my watch. It's a screen, and you can put 3 or 4 different stats that show up all the time that you're tracking. But I don't have pace on that screen at all. It's like heart rate, time, and distance, really. I think I only have 3 screens, and I don't really care about pace until after mile 35, and then I switch it over to pace. And so I take my heart rate monitor off now, and I just focus on pace, because that I think you'd have to help me the math on this, Joey, but I think to do a sub 24 is generally about a 14-minute mile for the whole race. somewhere around there. And
Yeah, I don't
so,
know exactly, but that sounds about right.
yeah, let's go with it. We'll pretend that's true. I can't do math in my head right now, but so let's say it's 14-minute miles, and that would include all your aid station time. And so, and you know that some steep hills are going to be 20 to 25-minute miles, and but I will try and see, and then you're kind of relying on perceived effort too, but you're pushing it up a hill, and what can you comfortably get in that comfortable gear, and where can you push your pace to and still feel pretty good. And then, if it's not a technical downhill, that's where you want to make up time. And so sometimes you can do a 9-minute mile. Sometimes it's too technical and maybe you're only doing a 13, 14-minute mile on a downhill, but you know that you're making up a lot of time because 14-minute mile would be a sub 24. And so even though you did a 20, 25 on some hills, well, now you're doing a 14 and sometimes a 9, depending on where you're at. And that is really how I try and push myself for the remaining 65-ish miles of the race is I do focus more on pace and perceived effort. Don't worry about heart rate after that. So that's all about pacing. And then you got nutrition. And I think Philip got this from Meltzer back in the day, but and I don't know Carl, but I don't, and I don't even know if he still does this, but I try to do 300 calories an hour, and I try to do most of it just goo. Um, Sometimes later on, when night hits in that, I'll try and do chicken broth, and I also will fill up one flask with Coke and another water during the nighttime. You don't need to drink as much at night, in my experience. And so that's kind of my nutrition. And I have a watch that goes off every 20 minutes. It reminds me to eat something. And if I'm really documenting and trying to pay really close attention to my calories. Another thing I've experienced is sometimes you get in an aid station and you just eat too much. You get so excited, and then a
Yeah.
couple of years there, I realized I was getting sick. Coming 20 minutes after the aid station, and so I'm really regimented on what I eat and when I eat now. And I went away from the watch for a few years, but now I wear two watches. I should get one that has maybe my Garmin already has a countdown timer on it, but I got just a cheap. I think it's a Timex Ironman watch that goes off automatically every 20 minutes for the whole race.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my strategy. Take salt caps during the day, depending on the heat, sometimes 6 an hour, which can be dangerous. You can make you really feel waterlogged. But so you have to be careful with that. I wouldn't take my advice on that one unless you've really practiced with it. But I did my worst 100 wasn't my first bear. It was the Wasatch 100, the heat year in like 2013, where it got up to like 95 in the valley, and I cramped a
Okay.
lot. And it was only taking extreme amounts of salt caps that seemed to help me. But anyway, that's enough
Wow.
on, I guess, strategy. There's also heat training, which I think is really important. That's where you want to go. But you tell me where you want to go now.
Well, yeah, let's break that down a little bit for people. So what I hear you saying, and you can confirm if this is if I've got it right here, is that you like to push the pace early, right? As the gun goes off, you're going to go out at your aerobic threshold, and that is probably more aggressive than most people do it. But that's your strategy, and it's worked really well. And you've learned that simply from the fact that when on your first one, you didn't know any better. You just went off of what somebody said, and it ended up working out for you. And in your words, your body didn't punish you for going up to your aerobic threshold. And I would probably assume that most pros are doing the same. They have the confidence to run at that pace. And that's likely where you've gotten so much faster over the years, is that your aerobic speed has increased, where you're not going into those taxing metabolic processes of where your body kind of goes where you start to have an oxygen deficit. You're staying right at that limit, but you're also maximizing your speed and staying in that oxygen limit. And that seems to make sense. And as far as nutrition goes, you're shooting for 300 calories of carbohydrate an hour. It's important to distinguish whether you're, and you said that you're doing it in gels, which likely means that that 300 calories is carbohydrate and not fat.
Mm-hmm.
Two very different fuel sources that should be pointed out there. And staying very disciplined. Do you ever feel like I'd just rather not have another goo? and you
Absolutely. And
still
most people
and you
say that.
still do it anyway.
Well, there's been years where I haven't, so a couple of years, the last 2 years on the bear have been my best times. And it's when I've been able, I'm in better shape though. And, I've been really focused on eating regularly, and I train like that from like on a long run from hour one, I'm eating 20 minutes in. And, I haven't had stomach issues doing that the last 2 years, but there have been three, four, five where, and the last two bears, by the way, have been pretty cool. So heat plays a factor as well. And sometimes your stomach is just kind of not feeling great. And sometimes the only way for me to get over it was to just not eat for an hour. I mean, it'll kill you. Especially, I typically, not purposefully, but just run fasted when I'm training during the week. Not for the long run, for sure, but. And so you kind of get a little confidence that, oh, so what if I don't eat for an hour? It's not going to kill me. So I've done a little bit of that. I've gotten. So sometimes I felt like I'm just starving, and I've learned that for me later on in the race, you can have protein, and so bacon or, um, some of the hash browns and quesadillas at mile 75. Well, it used to be 75 on Wasatch, but anyway, at Brighton are some of the best tasting things where you're having a little bit more protein. I've had sausages at mile 75, but so when I'm hungry, but it's hard to measure exactly how many calories you're coming in with those. So yes, and there was one time 2019 on Wasatch where I couldn't eat any more goos or anything, and I ended up running the last 40 miles, I think 35 miles or so, just drinking Coke. And so, but I haven't had problems since then, and I think part of it was training to eat from starting in May and focusing on getting those 300 calories in.
And it's likely, I'm going to make an assumption. You can tell me if it's correct here, but your faster times correlate with you eating well throughout the race and getting enough calories. And your slower times, the times when your races maybe aren't as noteworthy from a time perspective, are likely the times when you're having trouble with that. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, I think 2019, that's probably the worst stomach issues I've had. And I've never thrown up, so a lot of people do. And so I do maybe have some natural uh, blessing there where I don't always struggle with stomach, but I couldn't eat for the last 35 miles on that. And I think I did like a 27:59 that year. I don't know. It might have been 28, but anyway, I did okay there. But I really think to get, in the 23s, 24, 25s, I need to be able to eat for better
Yeah.
for the last 35 miles.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure. My time's better if I can eat consistently throughout the whole race, even though it does get hard sometimes towards the end.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, okay, so let's go a little different direction here. I'm curious about your mental approach to not only your race, which, like, let's break this down into a couple different answers here, but let's talk about your training first. It's clear that you really enjoy your training, and that makes it so much easier for you to, I'm imagining, to get out. You're not having to fight your own will. You're not having to drum up a lot of courage to get out and do these runs, because you're genuinely excited and looking forward to your weekly runs. And as the season progresses and the mountains dry up, that you really look forward to that and you really enjoy it. So I think there's a huge takeaway there that people should find the things that they're motivated so that they're not forcing the issue in a way that takes just that extra energy. That said, I'll use myself as an example. I think I enjoy the sport, right? I do put a lot of time into training. I enjoy it many times, but I'm not going to lie. When I look at my schedule and I think I really should get out for a 5 hour run, I really should get out for a 4 hour run. Man, that one's got a lot of vert. It's hot outside. All of the things that I'm tired. The week has been hard. All of those things create somewhat of a daunting feeling when it's time to go. Is for me, it would be particularly on the long runs where I have to gear up a little bit. Do you ever feel that way where you're ever like, man, I don't know if I want to go for a 6 hour run, but I'm going to do it anyway?
Yeah, it probably happens sometimes. I'm all about longevity, and so that's why I only like to really hit it hard in the summer. I think that's easier than training in the winter. Some people are almost like robots, and they know that this is a hard task to train for, and they're not worried about longevity, and they'll come and hit it hard and do amazing at the race, and then they're done. Or maybe they do a couple of them. Or I have an email list, and I goal is to at least get one friend out there with me, and they're waiting for me in the mornings. And sometimes we'll get three or four, sometimes a few more in the summer when everyone's training. But that social aspect to it is huge for me, and it's not as important for others people. I know a lot of people who enjoy running alone the majority of the time. I usually don't listen to music when I'm doing that. We're talking, we're being goofy. We have traditions on where to run on various seasons, so we get excited about the different trails. Obviously in the winter we like to run out of Antelope Island, and I love doing that in the winter. I never want to do that in the summer, because I'm gradually moving up higher in the mountains. So yeah, I think do what works for you, but I think my goal is to enjoy the training as much, if not more, than the race. I think that's because it's lifestyle for me.
Yeah, I'm gonna get sciencey on you here for a second, but there was an amazing chemist from the University of Utah from decades ago named Henry Iring. And the chemistry building at the University of Utah is named after Henry Iring. And he discovered a phenomenon in chemistry called activation energy. And what activation energy is, it's the amount of energy that has to go into the system in order for a reaction to begin. And a catalyst is defined as the presence of another chemical or another molecule or another something in there. And I'm not a chemist, so I apologize to anybody who really knows this subject if I've got this slightly wrong. But the catalyst lowers the activation energy. It allows the reaction to happen with less initial effort. And what I hear you saying is that your group, your friend group, and that doesn't work for everybody, but when you get one friend to say, okay, I'll see you there at 5:30 a.m., that now creates a chain reaction that lowers the amount of personal energy that you have to put into, man, like getting out of bed by yourself and dragging yourself out at 5 a.m., 5:30 is a harder, it's not far-fetched to think that that's a harder thing to do than if a friend's already going to be there and you're going to, approach the world together. And you also have somebody relying on you. So you do less kicking and screaming against your own psychology. So that's, I think, a beautiful takeaway for anybody is find your catalyst, right? Find the things that make it easier and more fun for you that you can sprinkle into your training. And that may be traditions of running certain routes at certain times of year, could be the friends around you. It could be having music or not having music. It could be anything around that. It could be podcasts. Some people may be listening to this podcast while they run, and that's their catalyst. So that's people need to go find that and utilize those catalysts. Um, Tell us, like, in a race, okay, the Steve Newman, if we were able to see into your brain and the psychology of your race, do you ever run into a situation where you're like, oh man, I completely overdid it, or I feel terrible right now and I'm at mile 45. How am I ever going to get to how, do you ever start projecting, and are there any tricks that you use to bring yourself back to a positive psychology? To share with you just a quick experience I had running a 50K one time. I got to mile 12 and started having a hard day. And I could feel the negativity starting to creep in. And I told myself, I'm not doing that today. And I somehow faked that I was having a great time. I started smiling. I started looking around. I started laughing. I started telling myself how amazing the views were. And sure enough, within a few miles, I genuinely did feel better and was psyched to continue the race. What goes on in Steve Newman's brain when things get hard, and it's easy to fall into the human nature of, I don't want to do this. Why did I sign up to do this? Why did I pay $400 to be in this race? Why did I spend all summer getting ready for this only to now just put myself through needless suffering? I think that's a common thing we all go through. What's your strategy, or and you don't have to agree with that. Maybe you're a special cut out of a special mold where that doesn't happen, but what are your thoughts?
I tend to be more of an optimistic person, so I am a glass half full kind of guy, and I mean, there's debates on whether that's helpful, but it helps me. But also, and when I mentor people, I think this is the most important thing is to believe that you're going to have 1,000-second wins, and that's an exaggeration, And second wind is a running term, obviously, where all of a sudden the energy comes back, and you can kill it. And the coolest thing to me, and I learned it from the first 100, is there's this adrenaline when you first start off the race, and it's cold and it feels good, or it's cooler, and you're running the first 20 miles, you probably feel great because you probably ran that distance quite a few times. 25, you're feeling good, and then it starts getting hot, and then 30. I never rarely run over 30 miles except on my race. And then it's getting hot, and your body's telling you that you haven't gone this far before, so it's protesting a little bit. And so it to me, it always happens about mile 30, 35. And I just have to have faith that I'm going to get my next second wind. And for sure, like if you can make it through the heat, and so maybe that's from like 12 to 6 or 7 or something. Maybe it's 12 to 5, I don't know. But if you make it through the heat, and when it cools down, every time I get a second wind, and then I'm almost hyper, like it's like, woohoo, this is so much fun, and then you take off again until, it's like 5 in the morning, and well, sometimes last year
You were finishing at 5 in the morning. So.
Yeah. But it's like 4 or 5 in the morning, and it's been dark forever, and it's cold, and all of a sudden the sun comes up, and you are, wow. And sometimes you're over like on the Bear, you can see the Bear Lake maybe, or, on Wasatch, it's like, I can't think, is it Duck Creek? I can't remember. Those were in Wasatch. But anyway, some beautiful scene you could see, and you're stoked again. But my first Wasatch, my buddy Ben paced me, and I do joke that 100-miler is almost an induced state of bipolarism. You got these high highs and these low lows, and he took video footage of that where I'm just so hyper, like I'm just talking, I'm chatty, and then like 4 hours later I look totally depressed and defeated, and it's hilarious to look at the psychology of that. But I've always known that another second wind's coming. So my advice to everyone, unsolicited advice, is always believe in those that you're going to have 1,000-second wins. That's the key for me. And also, when you're in pain, if you can sit back and just sit in that gear that you feel comfortable in, and just realize what you're doing is pretty amazing. And also, if you can enjoy the scenery, like that helps me. I mean, it's amazing what we're doing and where we're at most of the time, and that honestly does help get me through.
That's excellent. Uh, let's say that we had a drone, and this drone could follow you over the course of a whole 100-mile race. It's following you on your best race ever, which was I'm going to assume is last year's Bear 100.
Yeah.
And this drone is right behind you and can see all the details and follows every step. Where are, I imagine there are small moments throughout a race. I mean, the large part is just you're in the grind and it's step after step, and that's all it looks like. There's a guy running. But occasionally you may say, my foot doesn't feel right. I can feel a blister coming on. Or, you know what, I need to stop and take off this outer layer because I'm getting too hot. Or I need to put a layer on. There's these subtle moments that you would miss if you didn't have a drone that was flying over you constantly. What are some of those moments for Steve Newman where you take care of yourself in a very small and simple way that's not just one foot in front of the other, where it's like, I'm going to change something about, you're in the middle of nowhere, and we get to see you make a change or make a decision about something. What do some of those things look like?
Yeah, I think probably it's pace most of the time. Like if you're struggling, just slow down a little bit and just relax. I'll focus on breath too. Um, Pacer Tommy was pacing me 2 years ago, and and I'm an experienced runner, so is he. But he was telling me it was climbing from left hand fork up to Tony Grove, so it's kind of depending on where you are in the race, it's kind of at the tail end of the heat, and you got this big climb. And the Lambs Canyon on Wasatch 100 is also similar thing, and that was always been my weak area. But he was really getting me to focus on breathing, like, and really breathe, because sometimes for some reason when I come out of the heat and you go up Lambs or up to Tony Grove, like I almost start feeling like a little loopy, almost like inebriated and exhausted. And he really had me focus on deep breaths, like, I know it's ridiculous, but I think pace and breathing are probably some of the most significant things, just minor adjustments in a race that I make. I'll say my worst 100 was the heat year of Wasatch, and that was over 33 hours. And I spent over 4.5 hours in aid stations. And my best time last year was probably 20 to 30 minutes in aid stations. And most of the time, my goal had always been to be an hour or less. And so, I mean, yeah, there's changes you can make in aid stations. I try not to change my shoes. I try not to change blisters, or not unless I know it's somewhere that's going to drive me crazy and needs to be taken care of, And so that's about all I have on that.
Okay, so if there's no shame in adjusting your pace as you need to, because you're going to be out there a long time, and thinking that you can overpower yourself for 60 miles or something is probably not doing you a lot of service. Um, Wrapping up here, what advice would you give somebody who's out there considering their first really long race? Like, it doesn't necessarily need to be 100, but they're considering doing something that's well beyond their comfort zone. They're taking that step into, wow, can I really do that? Do I really want to do that? What advice do you have for somebody who's on the brink of choosing to do something as difficult as a 100-mile race?
Yeah, um, believe in those 1,000-second wins, and run zone two most of the time. Zone two running's fun. It's runner's high zone, and build your pace, build your base, and then that should give you confidence. And focus on the basics. It's pace. For me, it's heart rate, and it's calories, and waiting for those second wins to hit.
Excellent. What advice would you give to somebody who has run a fair amount of hundreds and maybe wants to see better progress, wants to see what wants to get to where you've been, where you are, where they have experience, but they need to do it better. What's one tip you would give somebody to take it to the next level? They've already done it, they've been there, they've done that, but now they want to do better.
Yeah, so I don't know, and I do want to put a caveat here that the guy who finished and won that race is like 7 hours ahead of me. So maybe talk to the real stars. I would say I'm not a pro. Yeah, I finished
You're
18th
you're
at
in the you're
Bear.
in the top you're in the 95th percentile, so it's fair to
Well,
say you don't need to be bashful about giving somebody advice here. I think
well,
everyone can learn something here.
yeah. Well, I'm happy to give advice, but I. So for me, I think what helped me also, Daisy, my wife, helped me with this because I used to like to do a ton more vert, and so it's more like hiking up and then running down, and like you can get in pretty good shape doing that. But I actually started doing more runnable runs and less vert, maybe, you know, 10 to 12,000 feet of vert instead of trying to shoot for 14, 15 in a week during the peak training, and actually get in running shape. And that made a significant difference on my running. I think the threshold run where I really started doing it purposefully last year. I'd done it before, but like making sure it was 45 minutes sustained and pushing my heart rate as high, as high as I could get it, while sustaining it. I think that was huge. And then, I'm pretty much an empty nester now, and so I could do extra miles. And while I think you can do 150 miles to 170 and finish 29, 28 hours pretty easy. And if the stars align, you don't have blisters or stomach issues, maybe even sneak into the 27, maybe even 26 if you're lucky. But I think to really get into the 24s or 23s, that takes maybe getting up, 230, 240, 250 range a couple months before the race. And then, yeah, that's all I got. That was more than one piece of advice, but there you go.
No, that's excellent. That's excellent. Well, congratulations on not just an amazing race at the Bear 100 last year, but a career of progress. And I think it's something that we all can learn from. There's a lot of amazing takeaways for people in this podcast. Everything from training easy most of the time is early in the season. Do not be blowing all of your motivation and blowing out your body by the time it's really when you're 5-6 months out. That's a ramp up time, and that's a time to be being very disciplined about holding your pace back. The ideas around find something that excites you, that is fun, that is local to you. What is the race that motivates you? What are the kinds of runs that motivate you? Find those. Find your catalysts. Right? What is the element you can bring into your runs that make you excited and reduce your resistance to going out there? For me, absolutely, going with friends is one of those. It's so much easier to go for a 5-hour run when I've got some buddies to share it with than it is when I have to slog it out on my own. And I do both, but the catalyst definitely is present when I've got my friends. And the catalyst can be whatever it is for whoever's listening, but you need to do some time thinking about what that might be and consciously introducing that. And then obviously your race strategy around uh, pay attention to your body and eat a lot and find what works for you in terms of getting those calories in. All of these things add up to success, and I would argue long-term growth in the sport here, which clearly you've demonstrated. So really appreciate you taking some time to answer these questions and share your thoughts. Once again, congrats on so many amazing races, and thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Joey. Good to talk to you, man. See ya.